Deep in the suffocating darkness of the windy cave, Lily was just trying to scrape away centuries of filth to carve out a livable corner, unaware she was standing on top of a fortune. As she chipped away at the grime-covered limestone, her crude tool struck something that didn't sound like rock. She raised her flickering lantern, expecting another jagged obstacle, but instead, the light caught a flash of electric blue buried in the wall. Her brothers had laughed at her pile of useless stones. But as Lily brushed away the dust, she realized the mountain wasn't empty. It was bleeding Yogo sapphires, blue as a Montana summer sky. Bitterroot Valley, Montana. November 14th, 1898. The gray sky over the Bitterroot Valley wept a freezing, relentless rain, mirroring the gloom that had settled inside the Vance homestead. In the sprawling, drafty parlor, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the heavy silence of morning. Or rather, the heavy silence of waiting. Old Elias Vance was in the ground less than a day, and his 3 sons, Caleb, Silas, and Jed, sat like vultures on the plush velvet sofas, their eyes fixed on the withered lawyer, Mr. Thaddeus, who fumbled with the wax seal of the envelope. In the corner, shrinking into the shadows of a high-backed armchair, sat Lily. At 16, she looked frail, her pale face framed by a simple black dress that seemed to swallow her whole. Mr. Thaddeus cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves crinkling. "To my eldest, Caleb," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I leave the homestead proper and the 300 acres of prime bottomland along the river." Caleb, a man with a jaw like a shovel and eyes devoid of warmth, leaned back, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. He crossed his arms, the master of all he surveyed. "To Silas," the lawyer continued, "I bequeath the sawmill and the exclusive logging rights to the northern timber ridge." Silas, whose mind was always calculating profits and losses, nodded sharply. That was where the real money was. And to Jed, Mr. Thaddeus read on, "I leave the entire herd of 2,000 head of cattle." Jed, the hothead of the family, slapped his knee, grinning. He was already counting the cash from the spring drive. Then the lawyer paused. He looked over his spectacles at Lily, his expression softening into something pitiful. "And finally, to my dearest daughter, my little princess, Lily." The brothers stiffened. This was the part they had been dreading, the part where the old man gave the girl the family silver or the hidden gold. "To Lily, I leave the parcel known as the Windy Cave, comprised of 12 acres on the eastern ridge." The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Then Caleb snorted. "Windy Cave?" Silas repeated, blinking. "That pile of rocks? You can't even grow ragweed on that patch." 12 acres of nothing, Jed barked, throwing his head back in a harsh, barking laugh. "The old man finally lost his marbles, didn't he? Or maybe he just knew what you were worth, sis. A pile of useless stones for a useless girl." Their mockery filled the room, jagged and cruel. They joked that Elias must have been delirious, or that he was burdening her with a tax pit. Lily didn't move. She didn't scream that it was unfair. She didn't demand a recount. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. The inheritance didn't matter. The land didn't matter. All she could hear was the echo of her father's voice calling her little princess, a voice she would never hear again. The pain in her chest wasn't from greed. It was the hollow, aching void of being an orphan in a house full of wolves. She wasn't being kicked out. Not yet. She knew she could retreat to her small attic room, the one place that still smelled like her father's pipe smoke and safety. But as her brother's laughter rang off the cold walls, Lily felt the crushing weight of her reality. She was a flicker of candlelight in a hurricane, small and solitary, standing on the edge of a jagged, rocky future. December 18th, 1898. Winter descended on the Bitterroot Valley with a vengeance, turning the landscape into a frozen purgatory of gray ice and biting winds. Inside the Vance homestead, the temperature was dropping in more ways than one. The tension snapped a month later, on a night when a fierce gale rattled the window panes. Jed stomped into the kitchen, shaking snow from his coat like a wet dog, his face twisted in a snarl. He claimed his prize ram, a valuable merino he'd planned to breed, was missing from the barn. It was a lie, of course. Or if the ram was gone, the wolves had taken it. But Jed saw an opportunity. He had been eyeing Lily's attic room. It was dry, warm, and perfect for storing his saddle gear. Far better than the leaky shed he was using. "It was her," Jed spat, pointing a calloused finger at Lily, who was scrubbing pots by the stove. "I saw her near the tree line before the storm hit. She was dragging that ram toward town, probably looking to sell it to make up for the rocks Daddy left her." Lily dropped the ladle, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. "No. Jed, that's not true. I haven't left the house all day." Her voice trembled, desperate and shrill. Caleb and Silas looked up from the table. They knew Jed was lying. Lily, with her slight frame, couldn't have dragged a stubborn ram 10 feet, let alone miles to town in this weather. But the truth was irrelevant. This was the excuse they had been waiting for. "We don't harbor thieves in this house," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "But I didn't," Lily pleaded, tears streaming down her face. She looked to Silas, hoping for a shred of logic, but he merely swirled the whiskey in his glass. "A thief is a thief, Lily, and a liar is worse. We can't trust you." The judgment was swift and brutal. Caleb didn't give her time to pack a trunk. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising, and marched her to the back door. Jed threw a rough canvas sack at her, containing barely a change of clothes and a stale loaf of bread, and shoved a flickering storm lantern into her hand. "Get out," Jed sneered, the jealousy and resentment of a lifetime finally satisfied. "Go live on your precious rocks." They shoved her out into the black void and slammed the heavy oak door. The lock clicked shut with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. Lily stood shivering in the mud, the freezing rain instantly soaking her thin dress. The wind threatened to extinguish her dim lantern, her only defense against the consuming darkness. She was utterly alone. Behind her, the warm glow of the windows felt like a taunt. Ahead, there was only the treacherous, muddy path winding up toward the desolate eastern ridge. With a sob caught in her throat, she turned away from the only home she had ever known. Clutching the lantern tight, she began the long, agonizing trudge toward the windy cave. She was no longer a princess. She was an outcast, walking into the heart of the storm. The Windy Cave, Montana, late December, 1898. The Windy Cave lived up to its wretched name. It was less a shelter and more a jagged scar in the mountainside, whistling with a constant, mournful draft that cut through Lily's wet clothes like a knife. She collapsed onto the stony floor, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. The darkness here was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Panic threatened to seize her, but the primal instinct to survive kicked in. She fumbled with numbed fingers for the matches in her lantern. One match flared and died, then another. On the third try, a small yellow flame sputtered to life, illuminating the damp, gray walls. Lily scrambled to gather wind-blown leaves and brittle twigs that had drifted near the entrance. She fed the tiny fire with the desperation of a drowning woman, coaxing it until it crackled. Outside, the howl of a coyote echoed the wind, a chilling reminder of the predators stalking the night. Terrified, she dragged heavy stones to narrow the cave's mouth, building a crude barricade against the wild. Huddled close to the flames, watching her own shadow dance monstrously against the rock, the dam finally broke. "Why, Papa?" she whispered into the emptiness, her voice cracking. "You called me your princess. Why leave me a kingdom of dirt and ice?" The injustice of it burned hotter than the fire. It felt like a cruel joke, a betrayal from the grave. But the sun rose, and Lily didn't die. The following days were a blur of grit and exhaustion. The little princess was dead. In her place was a survivor. She learned to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. She ventured out into the biting frost to collect snow for water and scavenged for shriveled rose hips and pine nuts buried under the drifts. Yet, as the shock wore off, something shifted. The silence of the cave, once terrifying, began to feel like a blessing. There was no shouting here, no cruel mockery from Caleb, no sly threats from Silas. For the first time in months, Lily breathed air that didn't taste of fear. Driven by a need for better shelter from the draft, she decided to explore deeper into the cavern. Holding her lantern high, she cleared away piles of debris and bat guano, moving toward the rear of the cave where the air felt strangely still and slightly warmer. She wasn't just cleaning. She was claiming this desolate hole as her own. She was bending the unforgiving world to her will, unaware that her broom of twigs was about to uncover something that would change everything. Spring 1899. What Lily had found in the deep recesses of the cave wasn't just shelter. It was a vein of Yogo sapphires, stones as blue as a Montana summer sky, embedded right into the limestone walls. But Lily wasn't foolish. She knew that if her brothers caught wind of a strike, they wouldn't just take the mine. They would bury her in it. So, she played a dangerous game of shadows. Once a month, under the cover of a new moon, Lily disguised herself in oversized, rough-spun trousers and a slouch hat. She hiked 12 miles over the ridge to Hamilton, a town where the Vance name held no sway. There, she sold a single uncut stone to a discreet jeweler, never enough to arouse suspicion, just enough to buy survival. With the coin tucked in her boot, Lily began to transform her rocky prison. She didn't just survive, she nested. She purchased thick canvas, planed lumber, and, most extravagantly, a pane of glass. She framed the cave entrance, sealing out the howling wind while letting the morning light flood in. She bought a cast-iron stove that turned the damp cavern into a warm, glowing sanctuary. But her greatest rebellion wasn't the comfort. It was the garden. The brothers had the rich bottomland, yet they grew only greed. Lily had rocks, but she had a vision. She remembered how her father had always craved fresh strawberries, a crop he could never get to take in the valley clay. Lily spent her days hauling heavy baskets of rich black loam up the steep slope from the creek bed, her back aching, her hands blistered. She filled the natural stone hollows outside her door with the soil, creating terraced planters. She planted the delicate runners with the tenderness of a mother. "There is no such thing as useless land," she whispered to the seedlings, wiping sweat from her brow. "Only people who don't know how to love it." By late spring, the miracle happened. The gray, lifeless, windy cave was alive. Inside, the walls glittered with the unmined sapphires she used as decoration, turning the room into a sparkling geode. Outside, the scent of pine was mixed with the sweet promise of fruit. Lily sat on her new porch, watching the sun set over her brother's distant, gloomy farmhouse. She was no longer the shivering girl kicked out into the rain. She was the queen of her own hidden kingdom, creating life where they said nothing could grow. She had found something better than an inheritance. She had found herself. Summer 1901. 2 years had turned the Vance homestead into a graveyard of ambition. A relentless drought had baked the Bitterroot Valley into a cracked brown mosaic. Caleb's fertile bottomland was now a dust bowl. Silas's sawmill stood silent, bankrupt, and Jed's once mighty herd had dwindled to a few skeletal cows chewing on dry sagebrush. The brothers sat on the porch of the decaying farmhouse, their moods as foul as the stagnant air. Then the wind shifted. It didn't carry the usual scent of dry dirt or pine resin. Instead, a breeze drifted down from the eastern ridge, carrying something impossible: the thick, intoxicating aroma of ripe fruit. It smelled like sugar and sunshine. Driven by a mix of confusion and gnawing hunger, the 3 men stumbled up the rocky path toward the useless windy cave. As they crested the final hill, they froze. The jagged gray scar of the landscape had vanished. In its place lay a miracle. Terraced rows of vibrant green leaves carpeted the rocky slope, dotted with thousands of ruby-red strawberries, swollen with juice. It was an oasis in the middle of hell. The door to the cave opened, and Lily stepped out. She was no longer the shivering, rail-thin girl they had thrown into the dark. She stood tall, her skin glowing with health, wearing a clean calico dress. She looked at her brothers, not with fear, but with a calm, unshakable dignity. "Lily," Caleb croaked, his voice parched. "Hello, brothers," she said softly. Seeing an opportunity, the brothers put on their best smiles, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. We were just coming to check on you," Silas lied, stepping forward. "Family should stick together in hard times, right?" Lily didn't answer. She simply opened the door and gestured for them to enter. If the garden was a shock, the interior of the cave was a revelation. It wasn't a dark hole, it was a home. A cast-iron stove radiated warmth, a sturdy oak table was set with porcelain, and shelves were lined with jars of crimson strawberry jam. But what made the brothers gasp were the walls. In the light of the oil lamps, the limestone glittered with the deep, electric blue of raw sapphires, gems Lily had kept to beautify her sanctuary rather than sell. The brothers realized with a sinking, nauseating clarity that they had thrown away a fortune. They had cast out a queen to live in a palace of her own making. "Lily," Jed stammered, his greed barely concealed. This We can help you manage this. We can move back in, expand the operation. We're family." Lily walked to the table and picked up a woven basket filled with the largest, sweetest strawberries. She handed it to Caleb. "You may have this," she said, her voice steady as a river stone. "Eat and fill your bellies." "And then?" Caleb asked, stepping closer. "And then you will leave," Lily said. The softness remained, but the steel underneath was undeniable. "I can share my harvest, but I will not share my home. This life is what I built from the rocks you threw at me. There is no room here for people who do not know how to nurture." The brothers stood in stunned silence, the weight of their own cruelty crushing them. They took the basket, shamed by her kindness and defeated by her strength, and walked back out into the dust. Lily watched them go, then gently closed the door. She sat by her fire, the blue walls shimmering around her, and looked out the window at her red garden. She had found the one thing her father always wanted for her. She was safe, she was strong, and she was home. Question for the audience. Lily chose to forgive her brothers enough to feed them, but she didn't let them back into her life. Do you think she made the right choice by closing the door, or should she have given them a second chance? Let us know in the comments below. Outro. If Lily's journey from a useless outcast to the Queen of Windy Cave touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button for warm heart stories. We bring you emotional, inspirational tales every week. Don't forget to like and share this video. It helps us grow our own little garden here on YouTube. See you in the next story.